special research seminar presented by Professor Yukio Lippit, 2024 Miegunyah Distinguished Fellow here at the University of Melbourne. Kio is here following a joint bid to the university led by my colleague Dr. Mark Erdman from the Faculty of Arts and myself representing ACAHUTCH, the Australian Centre for Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage, located here in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. Before I formally introduce Kio, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the lands of the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn and live, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples, and also acknowledge their enduring cultural practices in caring for country. We all pay respects to elders past, present and future and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. As a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students, we're privileged to work and learn every day with Indigenous colleagues and partners. So it's my very great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Lippit, who I first met in 2019 when teaching in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University. It's especially a pleasure to also do this here in the Japanese room, designed by Professor Shigeru Yura, who taught here from 1963 to 1965. Yukio Lippit is Jeffrey T. Chambers and Andrea Okamura Professor of the History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University. He received his BA in Literature from Harvard, his MA and PhD in Art and Archaeology from Princeton University. He's a specialist in Japanese painting of the medieval and early modern periods, and the author of several books, some of them award-winning, on subjects that range from the Kano House of painters in 17th century Japan, painting in Japanese Zen Buddhism, Zen portraiture, and ink painting of the Muromachi period. Japanese architecture constitutes another field of Professor Lippit's research and teaching. He offers courses on the history of Japanese architecture and works closely with Harvard's Graduate School of Design to train students in this subject, including working with the GSD's Loeb Library, which now holds the archives of Japanese modernist architects Kenzo Tange, Kiyanori Kikutaki, and Kisho Kurokawa. He was co-editor of the book Kenzo Tange, Architecture for the World, and co-author of Thinking Hand, Tools and Traditions of the Japanese Carpenter. His current research projects include a collection of essays on Japanese architecture and a book-length study on the Shosorin Imperial Treasury in Japan, a collection of over 9,000 8th century objects spanning numerous Road and East Asian cultures. Professor Lippit last week presented to our Master of Architecture students in Paul Walker's class, and Professor Lippit presented on Kenzo Tange at the Robin Boyd House in South Yarra. Last night, he gave a lecture on the Ise Shrines and the Metabolism of Japanese architecture. And today, the title of his presentation is Monument to the Unbuilt, Edo Castle and Wood Architecture. So please welcome Yukio Lippit.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Philip for the kind introduction and all of you for coming today. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mark Erdman, for helping arrange so many aspects of my stay in Melbourne. It's been thoroughly stimulating and remarkable for me, and the opportunity to talk about Japanese architecture in the Japanese room here is really a real treat. I wanted to just say at the outset that I used to be a historian. I am a historian of painting, Zen painting in medieval Japan, how painting relates to Zen Buddhism. But I've kind of shifted over the course of 20 years to become a historian of really Japanese architecture. And one of the primary objectives of my research these days is to write a textbook on traditional Japanese architecture. And what I'm hoping to do today is to convey a set of it might come across as slightly disjointed themes about kind of some of the ways in which I'm hoping to talk about Japanese architecture in relation to wood construction more generally. It's a little bit of a experimental narrative. It's in 8 parts. Please bear with me. I'm also hoping to co-author a book with Mark Erdman on Japanese castles, and some of the themes presented here will certainly, hopefully, make their way into the books. I look forward very much to your feedback. So here goes. It's a little bit obscured by the time, but I should say part one, the Absent Center. When I give tours, and I give many of the city of Tokyo to colleagues, friends, family, I oftentimes try to start at this monument here, which I call a monument. It's a strange thing to refer to what is essentially the stone foundation for a castle keep that doesn't exist. Now, this stone foundation is requires some context. It was formerly a stone foundation meant for Edo Castle, the seat of the Tokugawa shogunate in early modern Japan. And what you're looking at here is a map of what's then known as Edo around the 1650s. And you can see that the entire city is really designed around the grounds of Edo Castle and kind of spirals out into a city that in theory can keep on going if you keep filling in the bay. And what happens in Japan's 19th century is what a castle that was meant for a warrior potentate becomes the seat of the Japanese emperor, which is very strange from the perspective of traditional Japanese history. There's a kind of a two-part polity in which there's a warrior government in Edo and a traditional imperial government, which has kind of largely lost its authority in Kyoto. And so in the mid-19th century, with the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the emperor is relocated to Edo. It's renamed Tokyo. And so if you go to Tokyo today, you see the former grounds of Edo Castle. It's kind of a large, lush forest. It's kind of like the demilitarized zone in Korea, lots of endangered species. Is the seat of the emperor. But it's also where you find the remains of Edo Castle. And the remains of Edo Castle are all important for understanding the urban logic of what is Tokyo today, the kind of remnants of Tokyo, of the Edo Castle grounds, its moats, its ramparts, and so forth, kind of structure in many ways all aspects, I would say, of the inner wards of the modern city of Tokyo. So that stone foundation was completed for Edo Castle. Now, I'll come back to the stone foundation in a second, but when I say castle, I'm talking about the largest castle ever built in Japan, which you see a reconstruction here. It was initially built in 1607, kind of with the founding of the city of Edo in eastern Japan by a figure named Ieyasu, who was the first shogun of the early modern period, the first Tokugawa shogun. His son, the second shogun, Hidekata, lived there. The second and third shoguns really expanded the castle, and it was completed in 1636 by the third shogun, Iemitsu. And its keep, this high-rise portion here, which the Japanese is referred to as a pinshu, and I'll come use the word pinshu, was the tallest structure in Japan when it was completed, 1636, about 59 meters in height. Then it's destroyed by a fire only about 2 decades after it's built. In 1667, there is a great fire known as the Miegunyah fire that devastates Edo. It's very important in the history of Edo, kind of like the Great Fire of London, almost the same period actually. And Edo is rebuilt according to a different logic than it was initially. The status zoning and all of these other things changed. So when studying the history of Tokyo, this fire is important. Of course, the first thing that the authorities do is they rebuild Edo Castle. And it's a feudal society. So they mobilize all of these regional warlords down there to build parts of it, contributing labor, man labor, materials. And the Maeda daimyo, very important daimyo now in Ishikawa Prefecture, they are tasked with building the stone foundation. And they built one remarkable stone foundation that is 14 meters high. And that's what we see when we go to Edo Castle. So that was meant to be the foundation for a remarkable monumental keep. But what happens is the keep is never built. A decision is made by the governing figures to not build the keep. Okay? And that's kind of, it's often noted in passing in narratives of Japanese architecture, but I'm hoping that we can really focus on this moment because it's so important. So it's the most important decision to not build in the history of Japanese architecture, you might say. And there's a lot of meaning to unpack for that. So that's something that I have been focused on. Interesting cultural property now itself. So it does kind of stand as a kind of architectural monument. I've been very interested in why the decision. He was surrounded by shogunal elders, of which the most influential was the one who basically decided not to rebuild. He's very clear. He says it's a burden on the people. The entire city needs to be rebuilt. So to mobilize the entire citizenry of and the 260 domains to rebuild the keep at this time wouldn't be good stewardship. So it wouldn't be a great Confucian example of benign governance. The decision is made to delay the building of the keep. And in the next generation, basically kicks the can down the road. Says we are also not build the keep, but they don't say they'll never build it. Saying that we're going to postpone it until times are prosperous. And in 1712, they delayed the decision, and it's actually never rebuilt. So here we are today with a castle keep that should have been a monument of all monuments in Japan that's never been. That's essential in Tokyo, famously in Edo, famously Roland Barthes came to the structure, the French structuralist thinker came to Japan in the 1980s, and he writes a book about Japan where he talks about the empty center. Going to the Imperial Palace in Japan, there's a big forest in the center of the city of skyscrapers. But that idea of an empty center really extends back into the early modern period. And in fact, with no keep, Edo Castle was actually best represented within the skyline of Edo by a turret, a low-rise three-story turret, one of many that surrounded Edo, kind of lined and punctuated some of the archipelago. And the tallest of them is called the Miegunyah turret. It was rebuilt after the fire, but it's a very, very modest building. And one of the interesting things city landscape in the 19th century. And oftentimes, Edo Castle is actually depicted. But what most entries for print such as this, which is by Fixside in the 30s, misrecognize this as the keeper of the castle. It's a three-story modest turret, which actually stands in. It's kind of a mini version of the Edo Castle keep itself. And so here we are with this very flat forest, uninterrupted by high-rise buildings in the center of Tokyo with a striking skyline. So you go to the foundation. I hope you all do this. I would love to take you one day. You go to the stone foundation, you climb up the stone foundation, and it's the symbolic center of the old city of Edo. And you look around and you have this remarkable view of flat forest, and suddenly in the distance, the high-rise buildings begin. It's almost like an impenetrable cliff face at a distance. So that is something I'd like you to keep in mind, because I'll come back to the stone foundation at Edo Castle. But now I'd like to go to, and this should say part 2, rebuilding Edo Castle. And I want to kind of jump to the present, because there is a big movement now to rebuild the keep of Edo Castle within the grounds of the Imperial Palace. I'm not directly involved in this, although I'm on the fringes of this movement, because I certainly know a lot of serious architectural historians and architects and city planners who feel that Tokyo lacks a monument of appropriate scale and tradition in the Imperial Palace grounds, and that it really needs something of the monumentality of the old Edo keep there. So I've been very interested in interacting with and following some of the research concerning what it would mean to rebuild the keep of Edo Castle. I'm not supportive of the idea, but I'm interested in the process of thinking about it and what it tells us about building then and now. Conditions. What you see here are reconstructions of Edo Castle by the first generation shogun, Ieyasu, the second and the third. This is the version that burns down in the fire of 1657 and was never rebuilt. So this 1636 version, again, a very extensive floor with 830 mat rooms, 825 mat rooms. And this is where I want to show you a quick video of a CG reconstruction. I usually don't like to show CG reconstructions, but I am going to here because this one is particularly good and it gives you such a sense of the scale of, sorry, I'm going to new share here. Please bear with me. This. Sorry, I'm going to escape. It might be, sorry, Theo, I'm really sorry. You explained so well, but it might just be the lag, but I'm actually on a blank. Oh. Yeah, on. Yeah. Please bear with the music, and there's a little bit of annotation in narration in Japanese. Basically, this is it's a very famous college of basically oversaw the CG reconstruction, so it's very important. And he's talking about how this is the tallest building in Japan at the time. And we were entering into the basement of Edo Castle. And it's very repetitive in terms of its information, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what the inside would look like of this monument. I picture that basement and rise upstairs to the first floor. The floor is 1,300 square meters. So the height of the ceiling is 4 meters. You could fit a whole apartment building fully easily into just the first floor of the castle. It had 3 rooms. All of the construction of the two floors is this is a larger number of walls. This is so 467 tatami mats in size. That's a traditional way in the modular construction of pre-modern Japan to determine the scale of a room. So tatami mat is 6 meters by 1 meter. Basically, a kind of a human body, you might think of it. So there are 457 tatami mats. Then we're going to go to the third floor.
Here on the massive
Okay, so what you just saw was the interior of Castilian monumental structure. Gives us a little bit of a sense of what it is to construct the castle. In terms of the actual specific dimensions of the two components, it's estimated that the outermost squares of this is the first floor, the floor plan of the first floor would require pillars that are square in cross section and 36 centimeters per side. But the larger ones inside these ones right here, with partitioned rooms would be 42 centimeters per side, and the pillars at the corners would be the most massive. They would be 51.5 centimeters per side. And if you try to calculate the size of the that would be needed to construct pillars, would be about 80 centimeters or more in diameter, and that would also mean that they would have to avoid using the pit of the tree itself. So they actually have to be much larger than 80 centimeters in diameter. They probably have to be 500-year-old trees from the only preserved, carefully tended monoculture of hinoki cypress that goes all the way back to the 17th century, which would be the Kiso forest in the central Alps of Japan. And if we looked at a section of 60 of the pillars would be corresponded to what you see here, the yellow ones, which are just two floors within a castle for structural reasons to brace against winds and so on. I won't get into it here. We can talk about it later, but it basically is the high-rise engineering for traditional high-rise structures and massive pagodas and castles and so forth. So we're really talking about a really massive enterprise here. And one of the things that's interesting about the reconstruction of Edo Castle is actually the current state of Japanese forestry could yield the trees that are needed to build this, but it would really strain to the nth degree the capacity of Japan's biomass heritage in its current state. So I wanted to move to the next part and talk a little bit about castle efforts and the context for castle reconstructions in general in the modern era. If we could go in a time machine and go back to around 1850 to Japan, we'd encounter a land kind of filled with castle monuments. There would be one in each domain. There are about 260 plus domains in Japan. Not every domain actually. They would really what kind of punctuates the landscape, the cityscapes of the Japanese islands. And one of the interesting things is that that's actually begins to be domesticated in Japan, and we begin to have photos of castles from the late Middle period, from transition to modernity, which have been very helpful in imagining this landscape and thinking about the kind of the lost monumentality of Japan. Of those castles, there are some from castles that date to the early modern era, roughly 1600 to around 1850. These are all National Treasure designated landmarks. But how do we get from 100 by the new modern government of the Meiji era. In 1873, there was something known as the castle abolishment law. At least 100 of around, well, 160, 170 castles were actually dismantled for many reasons. They were remnants of the feudal era. They were already in disrepair, and kind of keeping them up wouldn't be viable. What remained was appropriated by the new military, the new modernized military of the Meiji government, and eventually it was used and abused and fell into disuse eventually. There's already, before the war, lamentation in the loss of this built environment heritage. And so you begin to see reconstruction efforts from the 1920s, 30s. And the first such castle to be rebuilt in the modern era is Osaka Castle. It's a very famous castle from 1585, associated with a famous warlord. It's actually destroyed by fire in the fires that led to the transition to a modern government in 1868, and it's rebuilt in reinforced concrete in 1931. There are many other castles that begin that are rebuilt, which was dismantled. After the castle was in 1873, it was the largest standing castle in Japan. But it is destroyed in the air raids of World War II. And one of the interesting things about this is that if you see the first Godzilla film from 1994, there's this wonderful moment where there's this moment where Godzilla is awakened from the sea, and the first thing that Godzilla does is come onto the main island and destroy Nagoya. And I'm not a psychoanalyst, but you might say that the kind of trauma of losing Nagoya Castle, one of the great symbols of Japan's pre-modern past during an era of ultranationalism and militarism, still is kind of, you might say, traces of it, vestiges of it remain clearly in the consciousness of the 1950s. And Nagoya Castle is reconstructed in reinforced concrete in 1959. And in its wake, there are just castles in every corner. Strange way of happening, but there are a number of castles which historically either never existed or are rebuilt in ways that, as a historian, kind of you couldn't possibly imagine. And then more recently, in the last 20 years, there's been this interesting entirely in wood, so not using reinforced concrete. And this has been a really interesting moment because this coincides with an era when the earliest reconstructions of castles in concrete are beginning to show their age and are really beginning to become structurally unsound, 50, 60 years, 70 years old. And those are, there's a moment when many municipalities, especially in the provinces of Japan, are thinking about rebuilding, but concrete is now a less viable option. And it's also just a wonderful kind of tourist attraction, and somehow in the imagination, an embodiment of traditional Japanese architecture practices, rebuild in wood. So the first to do so was actually Ozu Castle on the island of Shikoku in 2004. And there were lots of, again, old photos and documents that were used to reconstruct the Tenshu entirely in wood. Some of the wood choice I won't get into here is slightly, there's a lot of pine and things which are kind of non-traditional in Japanese architecture. And now it's a place, it's essentially a kind of a luxury hotel, a place that you can, if you have to spend several $1,000s to stay there every night, but it's something that's proved very popular for the municipality. And there's also a movement to rebuild the most famous castles, again, Nagoya Castle, entirely in wood. And there are actually photos of the first floor as well. Actually, Nagoya Castle, parts of its palace that aren't the high-rise keep have already been rebuilt spectacularly in 2019. You're seeing a few buildings. Of Nagoya looming. I'll talk about this a little bit later. And there are other movements to rebuild castle tenshu in wood. So we're in a state right now, again, where everyone's exploring this idea of building in wood. It's not just Edo Castle, it's Odawara Castle in Shizuoka Prefecture, Matsumae Castle in Hokkaido Prefecture, and so forth. I'll come back to this. When I was a PhD candidate at Princeton, I did a lot of, I took a lot of visits to castle keeps. And one of the most impressionistic visits took place at a site where I encountered this pillar. And I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about a very detailed aspect of the construction of castle architecture. In the early 17th century. I'm not going to say too much more about that, except that I was able to visit the interior of the keep, which at the time was not refurbished and looks something like what you see here. And one of the interesting things about visiting the interiors of castles is witnessing how shoddy the workmanship, I shouldn't say maybe partially the workmanship, but especially the wood itself can be. And here I'm showing you the interior of Wizard Castle. What you find is all kinds of unevenness and scale, basically a lot of found woods being used to construct the interior, and the best woods being saved for the exterior, the kind of outward-facing portion of the castle. Here's another view that shows the difference between the wood used on the interior and the exterior. Sometimes it's not even finished. The bark is left on. This is not tea house architecture where it's an affectation to leave the bark on, but this is simply rough hewing in place. But what's really interesting about Matsue Castle and my visit then was encountering pillars that looked that were faced with boards of wood that were then kind of stapled together. You might say nails or fittings. And I'm playfully call this a cyborg pillar, but it actually is circa 1600 in which you construct composite pillars from smaller parts that approximate the girth of more monumental pillars that should have been derived from monumental trees. And in castles in the early 17th century, you see many such composite or cyborg pillars, especially at the gates to castles, but it's a technique that's poorly create composites that will, you might say, approximate the structural integrity of a more monumental pillar. And one of the interesting things, the place where you witness this, these cycle most readily is that the reconstruction of Kodaiji in Nara. And when you go in there and you go right under the, look up, you see massive pillars, which are faced with wooden boards, and they are locked into place with these steel rings. But actually, the underneath, you have many composites. You have bundles of as many as 8 different pieces of vertical components of wood. And when you go in and you see the great Buddha, pillars all around. Here's another view of the site. There are many other sites that I can show you. Now, this is a pillar construction although it's really rare to find mention of it even in carpentry manuals. It seems to have been something that was expediently discovered by carpenters working under circumstances in which they couldn't get large pillars of wood. So this brings me to another section I'd like to talk about, which is about Japan's forests. If you look at maps of forest cover. I think this is pretty common knowledge. The same type of trees are found in the same horizontal bands around the globe. So the same latitudinal bands. And so we have the kind of boreal band at the very top, covering Russia, Canada, so forth. We have deciduous bands just underneath it. A lot of North American trees, a lot of that happens to correspond to the deciduous band, a lot of maples and so forth. And Japan is interesting. Interestingly, I was in first when I looked at Australia, just realized it's actually the very rim of the country that is basically a desert continent, a little bit of forestry. And so the Japanese islands should be in the deciduous band. And one of the interesting things about Japan is that it is 80% mountainous. And when you get to high altitude, the tree types at high altitude are basically the tree types you find in the boreal zone, one band above it. And so what that means is that you have a very rich set of tree types. And what you find in the boreal zone, the conifers and all those are really what are used for architectural construction. What you find in the lowlands, basins, and so forth are the woods that you use for furniture and smaller scale kind of wood construction. And this, and as of it actually becomes predominantly wood-based, as opposed to China and Korea, much more Hinoki cypress is Japan's architectural wood of choice. It has many features that are very attractive for large-scale wood construction. Usually it grows kind of in a straight shot, straight grain up to about 40 meters in height at the very high. Mostly it's about 25 meters, but the tallest trees will go up to about 40 meters. Within world tree types, that's not very large. Redwoods can be up to about 120 meters. Those are massive, but this proves very well. The grain is very kind of usable, workable for carpenters. It's got a kind of a purplish color, a nice aroma, and so forth. But we already know from a lot of recent research into the history of Japan's forestry that there was deforestation occurring arguably as early as 600 in Japan, in the regions where the ancient capitals were still known as the Kinai region, where Chinese-style monumental capitals have buildings with tiled roofs, curving, these extended well beyond the wall plane, whose weight is distributed to the outer perimeter of columns and bracket sets created by a wooden exoskeleton. Those become the primary types of architecture for government buildings, for temple buildings. This is the first temple building in 596, and so forth. And it's probably it has been called the ancient predation in about 600 to 850 or so, when a kind of a wood-based civilization emerges in the Kinai region. So what you're looking at is a map where you see Japan's main island, and there was heavy logging until about the year 800. What you see with these striations here is about 1550, and then the rest of Japan by about 1700. The initial stage of predation occurs right about in the center of what's known as the Yamato state. And one of the interesting things about that is that we can put in dialogue the development of Japanese wood architecture and its stylistic history in relation to forestry and the history of deforestation in Japan. What you see in the medieval period is a move away from all of the woods that were most prized by carpenters, cypress, the cedars, and so forth, and what you see on the pillars of this Japanese room here, and a move towards so-called hardwoods, such as Zelkova. These are not straight-grained woods. They often have what's known as crazy or marbled grains, and they become the primary wood. They're not even originally. And that necessitates a change in carpentry. And so there's a big change in tools right around the 13th century, where there's technology transfer from actually Japanese swords to tools. some of you may know, Japanese swords, they're steel, but it's basically the metal is specific. There's high carbon steel, which is laminated over no carbon steel. So what that means is a very, very light blade that can be thin, but it has very hard edge. The Japanese sword is very light and thin, but feels good in the hand. It really responds to the microkinesthetics. And that technology is transferred to carpentry tools, chisels, and so forth, right in the 13th century, and it enables carpenters to really work with harder woods such as Zelkova. And one of the interesting things about this this phenomenon from the perspective of architectural history is that it actually directly, I would say, informs the stylistic history of Japanese architecture. If you look at Katsura, which was built in Katsura Villa, built right around circa little first decade after 1600, begins to be built, you see a lot of woods that are used that showcase grain. And in general, the appreciation of wood grain, you might say the dendro aesthetics of Japanese architecture that showcase grain specifically and different marbling, and then ways of kind of modes of viewership and spectatorship of architecture, the kind of projection of all kinds of interesting poetic ideas and even kind of forms onto abstract wood grain really begins to emerge in the 16th, 17th century. And it's related in some way to the choice of hardwoods like Zelkova, the very interestingly grained woods that are beginning to be embraced circa 1600, and these affectations surface in order to showcase the grain, and that can be likened to ripples in a pond or other ideas within the kind of details of Katsura and other sites. But it's really with castle construction. This is where I think increasingly it's fair to call this the early modern tradition from around 1660 to 1700. It's a period when you have much further massive discourse of its prized architectural woods, and it's primarily due to castle construction. And I would say if there's any moment of transportation, it is in the monumental projects of this warlord, Hideyoshi, who was someone who's credited with unifying Japan. It's kind of a warring state situation at the time. He begins to unify Japan, and he begins to impose taxes and feudal and taxes on regional warlords. And one of the things he does is to kind of feed his monumental building projects. He requires large amounts of high quality timber from daimyo, for example, way up north in the Kentucky region of Japan's near islands. He sends officials out to regional domains for cadastral surveys. He also includes surveys of forestry or using of timber. So all kinds of woods are pouring into the China region from all over Japan. Very different kinds of woods, leading to very interesting kind of combinations of for the arboreal profile of Japan's monuments. One of the things Hideyoshi does is he's building castles, and he rebuilds the Great Buddha Hall, which is the great state Buddhist temple that was formerly in the ancient capital of Nara. He was devastated during the civil wars of 16th century. He rebuilds it in Kyoto at a monumental scale. It's destroyed by an earthquake, but I've been collecting as much, I've been trying to tease out information about the construction of the Great Buddha Hall as much as possible. It's fascinating to see how this project, it involved his successor Ieyasu, who sent loggers out to find a tree that would yield timber over 80 sorry, I'm using feet here, but this is actually using the metric system, well over 25 meters in length. And just the arduous nature of the transportation and so forth required to produce the timbers in the 1590s was fascinating to watch. I've also the reconstruction of reports, the conservation reports of buildings from the 17th century in the wake of the Great Era of castle construction. One of the interesting things about that is that we can determine with precision what woods were used in which components of a building. And you begin to see a fascinating mix. Usually a building, the skeleton, the wooden skeleton of a building has many different layers. It has layers of wood from its initial chapters of construction, from kind of later wood layers, etc. You can see that the wood choice reflected at each stage of the conservation of a building reflects the state of forestry in Japan at the moment. And it is clear that Japan has less and less and it's also in the late 17th century, really beginning of environment. From the late 17th century, lots of tensions in Japan due to deforestation. It's almost like water rights. There are lots of tensions between villages that actually the shogunate. There's a huge population growth, a competition for forests. There's also erosion and flooding. This leads to a period of regression and appreciation. Also, the more individual value in provinces of Japan really begins in managing their own forest. They have given up on the shogunate and the central government to do anything. And begin to see the rise of conifer plantations and the intensive study of silviculture by many different regional daimyo, but especially in this area right around here, which leads to the establishment of the famous Ise forest. The area which yields the most, really the only area which yields the 400 and 500-year-old cypress trees that are used for really, it kind of has exclusive access to a large portion of the Ise forest today. Okay, I want to move now. This is a little bit of a, I hope it's not a non sequitur part. This is part 6. And this is Meiji Shrine. Another area I like to take people in when I'm doing tours of Tokyo is the Meiji Shrine Forest, one of the most remarkable forests you will ever visit. It's extensive. It's in the kind of southwestern part of Tokyo. It feels really monumental and secluded. It's really remarkable to go from the dense urban fabric of Tokyo and step into the Meiji Shrine forest and encounter what you encounter. Here's an aerial view. This looks like actually the Imperial Palace and its forested area. It's the kind of second great forested area in Tokyo. But one of the interesting things about the Meiji forest is the fact that it's entirely engineered. It's kind of a modern engineered forest to approximate what people imagine to be the great forest that once surrounded the major imperial shrines of ancient 7th and 8th centuries. And the pretext for the forest is the death of the Meiji Emperor, the first modern emperor in 1912. And it was at a time when imperial ideology, modern imperial ideology, was on the rise. And there was a big movement to create a proper shrine for the emperor. And now the problem was the Meiji Emperor himself left a will in which is a very mean children. That's where he was born, was forced to live like and this is kind of a traumatic thing. And so they said, well, we'll build a shrine instead, a kind of to commemorate him instead of a tomb. And they built the Meiji Shrine. And it was a national effort. It was begun in 1912, 8 years. There were many volunteers from all over the country who planted trees, who brought and planted trees. It was kind of like castle construction. So there are 7 of forest, 350 different types of trees. But what's interesting to me is that the trees are chosen based on how they look in the future. That it was very carefully planned and staged as an eternal. And the planting is planned in phases. So in black to structure the forest more prosperous, black oak and other evergreens to fill out texture. So if you go today, when the forest is actually about 100 years old, experience the forest just as is. You can kind of sense its engineering. Very carefully planned in stages. And it's fascinating for that reason. In fact, there are more changes to come, planned to come in about 20 to 50 years, and the master plan is constantly being revisited. And so I guess it is a little bit non sequitur, but I kind of wanted to just throw in a discussion of Made Shrine for us in relation to this discussion. So I might come back to it in just a moment. But what I wanted to do was return to Edo Castle. To ask the basic question of what exactly a castle is, or what was a castle. Research into the relationship between the man-nature relationship as seen through the history of Japanese architecture really forces us to reconsider some basic assumptions about castle architecture. And this is where I've learned, again, a great deal. Castle is basically, you can think of it as having three components. There is a stone foundation, and then there is a high-rise keep, and then there's a palace, a low-lying palace separate from the keep, where actual governance and residential life take place. This is interesting. Here, what you're looking at here is the interior of the castle. But this is the palace portion, not the keep. This is where children sit right here, canopied by the tree background, with a small group of elders or daimyo, maybe 20 or 30. It's not very large. I was recently the advisor to a Netflix series called Blue-Eyed Samurai, which is an animated series that takes place in Edo. And I was kind of in charge of helping them build out the built environment. They wanted there's an assassination that takes place in the throne room of Edo Castle, and they wanted something from Game of Thrones, which is very massive. And I kept saying, no, it has to be intimate. It has to be 20 people. And I said, are you sure? Can it be 200? I said, no. It's a very intimately scaled interior. But the outward facing monument about this is that only the first castle in history, Azuchi Castle, which had the warlord reside in the keep. After that, the warlord, almost every other castle after the warlord, really moves to the palace to live. And the keep becomes a kind of empty architectural sculpture of monumental scale that maybe guests are sometimes taken. There are records of guests being taken up to the top to enjoy the view, important guests, enjoy the view of the city that you see from the top of the keep. And there was this idea that if there ever was an attack, then people would retreat to the keep and it would be, ideally defensible. But otherwise, they went largely unused. And this was also a moment in which Japan was shifting from wartime to peacetime. So the timeline for castle architecture is predicated upon a period when warfare was constant and one also had to be careful of betrayal by one's subordinates, but actually unfolds during a peacetime era when there's absolutely no use for castle keeps. And so castle keeps really become administrative center. They become really symbols of the potentate in any given period. They become a required part of the skyline that reflects the presence of a figure of warlord. And this is really important to map onto the timeline of Japan's forestry. I think the Tokugawa shogunate did that was and there is a law that's passed in 1660 of one castle per domain, trying to limit castle construction, both because they wanted to limit the symbolic authority of potentially rival warlords in Japan, but also because it was so depleting of resources. And in fact, if you go through the Edo period, is when keeps are destroyed and not reconstructed. Hopefully, are not really examples. There are a number of important examples of keeps that are never reconstructed. Saga Castle, the fifth largest keep in history, burns down. It's never rebuilt. I show you a few. There's the Saga Castle, Kokura Castle, burns in 1608. It's built in 1608, burns down in 1837. Never rebuilt until the post-war period, when it's rebuilt in concrete. For those of you who know Kyoto well, Kyoto Cathedral Castle doesn't have a keep because it burned down in the 18th century, was hit by lightning, destroyed by fire, and it was never rebuilt. Hideyoshi's Osaka Castle is also a famous example of this. So what we have are examples of decisions not to build, of non-building, acts not building, that punctuate the course of the Edo period, which in my view turn out to be very important ways of thinking about the history of Japanese architecture during this period, and are kind of brought to a, you might say, a point of intensification with all of the plans to rebuild Edo Castle. So this brings me to the concluding again, this kind of very ambient session about the writing of the history of Japanese architecture. And I've been thinking about what are the monuments, what are the case studies through which we kind of author a history, a narrative about building in Japan. And it's become important to me to kind of focus on those moments of non-building, but it's also redefined those structures that do survive, such as the Great South. This is a monumental gate, a monumental temple, the rest of it one of the 1190s. And it's a very famous example of a style, a very straightforward, austere style of monumental wood construction that's associated with southern China, and a new wave of wood construction that comes into China. But I think increasingly we can also consider it a monument to the state of forestry in Japan in the late 12th century as well, because this region avails itself of 18 pillars of massive size of dirt that were procured by a monk named Shogun who oversaw the reconstruction from the western tip of Japan. Because scoured the western portion of the main island for these pillars, and then he could build a very remarkable infrastructure to kind of transport the logs from the western tip of Japan's main island to Nara, the ancient capital. And in fact, he had to kind of find temples along the inland sea and create these waiting stations and so forth. It's a really remarkable story. But that's really what this is a monument to as well, of a state in Japan that wants to yield these very massive timbers and actually realize monumental construction in the way that it was imagined kind of in the ancient period. I've also, though, been thinking a lot about the importance of castle reconstruction to transmit the intangible practices of building to Japan's pre-modern period that survived into the present, but are kind of now, in many cases, on the verge of extinction. So a lot of Japanese buildings are designated tangible cultural properties based upon what I think are very kind of personal cultural properties that were established in the late century. But these laws also speak to intangible cultural properties, dance, traditional craft, and so forth. And a lot of it has to do with building. There are a lot of aspects of building a traditional building. I'm just showing you a smattering of living national treasures. These are practitioners who embody traditional practices and are designated, given a stipend by the government in the past to kind of convey their teaching to disciples, and that's kind of as they go forward. There's some controversy surrounding these laws. There are a lot of artists who chafe at having to kind of be they love the funding, but they kind of chafe at some of the requirements that come with that funding. But one of the interesting things about architecture, or armature, or the transmission of so many traditional Japanese building crafts that are intangible. And it's a very interesting way in which the castle feel like monuments, traditional monuments, also something very intangible that kind of dematerializes it as a set, as a, I guess, bundle of sensory data that has been transmitted uniquely, I think, in Japan. Its transition to modernity has allowed it to have a robust arts administration and set of intangible cultural practices related to buildings. And so this means that occasionally, even castle keeps have to be rebuilt if we're serious about kind of conveying these practices in something like the authentic forms in which they've been handed out. I'll end there. Thank you very much.